This is Queer Game Design panel, and we'll start with just introductions. So my name is Maury Brown, and I helped organize this panel, and I'm the moderator, and I have some experience working with queer and feminist game design to make more inclusive communities, particularly through New World Ventuscola. Beat Generation LARP just was a specific queer experience, and so I'm very privileged to be with these other designers here who I will let introduce themselves.
Going right to left, right?
Oh, we're here.
Okay, all right. Hi, I'm Rowland. I am a designer, a freeform designer, but probably more widely known for my work in safety. I work usually with explicitly queer designers, making games that are mechanically queer, which I get into more later, and also queering spaces in the realm of safety as well. So.
My name is Alex Roberts. I'm a game designer, writer. I work for game making companies doing lots of fun different stuff. And I also work in explicitly queer design.
I'm Kat Jones. I am a game designer as well as a game studies scholar, and I do some facilitation and organizing in various spaces. And I feel like I try to weave queerness into my game designs, even if the theme is not explicitly.
My name is Quinn Milton. I use Z or they pronouns. I am a queer artist and game designer. Lots of different things and disciplines and multimedia stuff around that. And I've also been working in communities that are predominantly queer for about a decade now.
I'm Sadia, they, them. I also am a queer game designer for Event Horizon LARP, and also for kids and teens with Wayfinder.
Good. So we're going to start with some easy questions, and then I have some questions, and then we'll take some questions from the audience. I do want to put out a few sort of thoughts, definitions of things. So what queering a game includes things like designing a game to tell us something about real-world systems through play, building empathy and solidarity across identities and experiences, fostering inclusivity and imagining a world where queer liberation is possible and playable and actionable, challenging game mechanic assumptions through using queer mechanics, challenging existing power structures, questioning notions of things like stable identities. All of these things can come out designing to foster representations of non-masculine identities or all identities, multiple ways of positioning and orienting oneself as non-straight within the game, or including other things. What is queer design to you?
We start with that one?
Yeah. You don't have to. Do you want to go right to left? We don't have to. You can popcorn.
Who's right?
I think I'm right.
Go ahead.
Okay.
Also, I want to do this. Whoa, that was bad. Move this down so that, because we have this one.
I feel like this is the mic.
We have the four.
I can be loud. It's
Yeah,
one
we're
of my
fine.
yeah.
We're loud. It's all right.
Yeah. I've worked with kids. I can be loud. So I think that queering anything is impossible if you're not actually queer. That's a whole dialogue. It is also inherent oftentimes to the work we do as queer designers is you are always bringing a queer perspective to the design that you are doing. And that perspective often inherently is going to make your LARP more open and available to queer players and a queer player base. I think that the best way to queer your LARP is to hire queer people.
I'd like to touch on a definition of queer. This is just my personal opinions, but queer is something that defies definition in a lot of ways. Unlike other LGBTQ identities, it is not straightforward and dogmatic. It's not explaining like, I am gay and this means X. You can kind of assume that it means a certain thing among people who identify as such. With queer, when someone says that they are queer, I don't really know what that means for them. I have some ideas, and part of that is I am not just one identity. Queer is a bit of a postmodern identity. It is also about your orientation socially and with the world. Part of being queer is related to being deviant and against the norm, and that's a great thing. It shouldn't be ignored. I think that if what is considered now is queer becomes the norm, something new is going to be queer. That is not the norm. So for queer game design, it's about acknowledging that there are norms and deviances outside of the game, and there may be different or similar ones within the game, and it's about acknowledging that and playing with it and designing for it in ways that benefit, accept, and encourage actual queer people and players and people who might need to or want to change, explore, experiment with their identity and presentations as such.
All right, for me, queer game design or queering game design is a lot about, as some of the other folks have said, being able to embrace ambiguity, being able to embrace fluidity, and I think that can take the form of the kind of narratives that we tell. It can take the form of the kind of characters that are portrayed in a particular game. It can take the form of the power dynamics that we allow to be parts of our games, and the mechanics that we put into our games. For me, queerness always has a political implication. Like, it's more than just an identity. It's also about, like, I'm going out into the world and I'm queering it, so get used to it, basically. And having that sort of like in the back of my mind as I'm designing games, right? How can I challenge assumptions? How can I make people think differently? How can I make people, my players, do things in ways that they might not be comfortable with, or that, again, this idea of sort of playfulness and play, I think, is really important in this idea of queer game design, and how can we play with things that people might take for granted or might seem sort of set in stone.
Yeah, thank you, Kat, for bringing out playing with things rather than redefining things. That to me is where queer game design comes from. I think that anytime a queer person is designing a game, it's going to have their implicit assumptions, it's going to have their experiences of the world, and hopefully, if it is something that comes from them and comes from their heart, then it will be reflective of their real experience on Earth. And something that's really important to me is that, like, I'm actually not that interested in queering other people's games, like fixing sort of heterosexist settings or, you know, queering this particular mechanic or whatever. I'm interested in queer people making maps of the world, particularly those parts of the world that they've already been given maps for that don't match up to their experiences at all. You know, a lot of us, because I gotta assume that most of you are queers in here, you know, we get told that, hey, when you do X, Y is going to happen. But we exist in the world, we do X, and Z happens. Something that you can do in response to make a game where if the players do X, Z. And that's a way of, okay, whew, now I have a map of the world. And maybe you can share that with someone, and maybe they will like empathize with you. Maybe that would be satisfying to you, but I actually don't care about that part almost at all. I'm interested in making a map that, okay, finally I can navigate the world. I'm interested in other people doing that. And I'm interested in us making those games for each other, right? Imagine giving, you know, you two do a lot of work with youth. You know how satisfying it is to give a young person a map that, okay, just so you know, a bunch of other people are going to give you maps that will send you in all kinds of weird directions that are not going to map. with your experience of the world at all, and you give them something that says, just so you know when X, Z is going to happen, it's very satisfying. So that to me is queer design is actually just map making that is not the norm, that is not the map we've been given.
I am in agreement with some things I've heard up here. That would include that being queer is political. I think queerness is an inherently political identity as opposed to like one derived from like gender or like sexuality. I mean, you can like. I'm trying so hard not to use potty language. Can we vote?
How does the room feel?
How's the room feel?
Fine.
Swear. So do it. Yeah. So it's like fuck the police.
Does anyone have any particular opinions that they would not like to have coarse vocabulary used in this room?
It is okay to raise your hand.
I will censor myself. Great. Okay. So yeah, like you can be like a femme person who fucks with femme people, and that's like cool, and that makes you like gay or whatever. But it does not make you queer. And I will die on that hill. I think being queer means it's like actively queering spaces in a political way. And those spaces, I mean, not necessarily physical like spaces, but you sort of like queering taxonomies. That'd be like a game space or like queering bars, you know, queering academia, right? These are not explicitly locations. So that is my definition of what queering means, and I think it's a lot harder in that context. And also I'm in 2018 not super sure what like queerness, what the value of like queering things really is. It is a difficult thing to say because it's taken on so much more meaning, rather than like being one who uses queer theory as it once was, or being like deviant, as like these are different definitions. I think now it's more of like its solidarity is more important with like other marginalized people. So like being very like knowing how heteronormativity intersects with anti-blackness, for instance, right? These are like the more important things that we should be focusing on, rather than like being gay. It's cool, which it is, by the way. Highly recommended.
So, I guess to synthesize, there are many definitions of queering and queer, but that actually is part of queerness itself, is that if we were to all consolidate upon this like notion of what queerness is, or what queer theory or queer design or any of those things is, it would, as I believe Quinn said, it would sort of no longer be queer, right? And so there's an element of personal experience that Alex touched upon, about designing from personal experience to give the maps of queerness, but then there's also the, let me show you a new and let me take the dominant way and twist it to make it more open, to allow for the space of inclusion for queer identities, for queerness, for queer to happen. And then through gaming, you get to experience it. And I differ slightly from Alex in that I do care about the...
Someone's got
to do it, right? Because what happens for a lot of, what I have discovered through people who've come to New World Magic School who have never in their lives been around queer people or queer spaces, that suddenly they come, I know, and it may be hard to believe that those people exist, but they do, and they're like, wait, I have now actually met and interacted with someone who uses they pronouns, or I have actually experienced a place where I learned that I could be okay with all sorts of configurations of relationships, or that it isn't necessary, that I actually have a thing where I make assumptions about who belongs in power, and because I've experienced a queer space. And so to me that is going to hopefully lead to people understanding each other.
What's that expression? Get your people, right?
Yeah, actually,
Yeah.
just wanted to say something really quick about that, is that it's great that like you know what you're caring about and what you're doing, and it doesn't have to be everything,
Right.
and you're doing something different for different people, and you almost touch upon like, why are we sticking like in only this lane? Like, how are we, or are we thinking about like how queerness impacts other things and other intersectionalities and identities?
And I think we need to start talking about like specifically intersectional queer design, because when we think about like, if you think about like the history of heterosexism and how that's so intertwined with colonialism, I don't know how you can't, and I encourage you to research that very much beyond the scope of this panel, but.
No, we're gonna say everything there is.
So let's
Research stops here.
But once you start looking into that and going, oh, okay, well, if those two things are so intertwined, right? If the sort of globalization of heterosexism is not byproduct, but is in alliance with colonialism, then you think, oh, okay, well, shit, we better prioritize people of color and prioritize especially indigenous people. And everyone who is under the heel of colonialism, those people, when we talk about queer spaces, because they're the people who are going to have that perspective. So as one example.
Yeah, just throw a few buzzwords out for you guys to ping pong around. Like, when we talk about queer representation, queer inclusion, right? Queer design, queer community, and then moving towards intersectionality, which I think we should probably give a baseline definition in case there are folks in the room who are not quite sure who feels comfortable doing that.
Does anyone have a degree in gender studies?
Yeah. We're all like, everyone's turning.
Not that having a degree makes you an expert. I will recognize that on the panel. So for me, the definition that I use about intersectionality is about understanding, first of all, understanding identity as not additive, right? Patricia Hill Collins talks about pop being theory of identity, right? That it's like, I'm a woman, I'm queer, I'm a Latina, and these are all separate things. No. Intersectional theory says we have to understand how these things are simultaneous in our identities and how they impact each other. Intersectionality also means that when we talk about queerness, we can't talk about it in isolation from other aspects of identity, such as race, such as class, such as gender, such as religion, right? And in certain contexts and certain situations, particular intersections may become more or less salient, right? But to just talk about queerness as like a thing overlooks the ways in which our experiences of what queer means and what it means to be queer and all of these things are fundamentally shaped by these other aspects of our intersecting identities.
Right. So think of something like a game, which is a set of if-thens, is extremely well suited to talking about that kind of thing, right? That like to really break it down, like, okay, if your character is an elf, this happens. But if you make them an elf and you make them a ranger, they get all this stuff. But if you had made them an orc and made them a ranger, then these things would happen, but then these things would change too. So people pretty much understand this stuff.
So, but I wonder what Crenshaw would have to say about that. That's pretty funny. Yeah, I guess I interpret intersectionalism, I guess, from a more like purist, like Kimberly Crenshaw standpoint, where I really try to focus on like. To me, it is like a framework for us to focus on the most marginalized and support them very specifically. So, like Crenshaw would be like, when it was writing about intersectionality initially, it was about like gay black women, and I still think, in my mind, that's the goal of it. I think we often talk about it in more general terms, but I think it's important to sometimes recenter its inception and say that, hey, like we need to, like, the idea of this is not to necessarily talk about like being like white and poly, for instance, but like more about being like the people who are suffering the most material harm.
I would like to add, though, that I think it's really important that we use intersectionality to recognize the unmarked norms, right? So if we talk about queerness and we don't talk about whiteness, then white queerness, it becomes very easy for that to become the unmarked norm, right? And so I totally recognize, I think, recentering and looking at sort of where intersectionality came at its beginning is super important. But I think when we don't talk about whiteness or middle classness or these sort of dominant identities, it's easy for them to just become normal personhood, right? And that is something that I strongly, strongly work against, and I feel like is very much an important aspect of my queer game design, is marking things that often go unmarked and helping us to recognize that unmarked norm shapes the way that we think about things in fundamental ways.
Pat and I have similar goals in the game design for that, of exactly that, because without thinking about intersectionality, is that it can lead to these toxic opinions that you're talking about as implicit dominant structures. Like, if we were to make all of the, to use an example from Magic School, if we make all of the unsoiled heritage or pureblood heritage wizards have families that have a mother and a father, right? Then we've made an implicit, we've said this is a game or space that has queer alignment and queer things, but then all of these families are functionally in this really dominant way. But without intersectionality, you can have people that just make these assumptions, and it can lead to fighting in the community too, because you have, for example, trans-exclusive feminists, right? Because there was just this notion of they had this one idea of what woman means, whereas instead of looking at it from an intersectional perspective, and then it becomes normalized. Inclusion, representation, embodiment. How does embodiment change?
Well, we talked about that a little bit when we were saying that like our priority in Event Horizon is not with
It's not representation.
it's not representation, it's not dictating like here are the characters that are representing this thing, like in the lore, like you have to know that this X, Y, and Z, like we tick up all the marks of representation, but rather embodying, so that is people bringing their bodies to the game and their own experiences is kind of inherently more visceral and powerful because you're there physically with people of hopefully in your communities a lot of different identities, and hopefully in the future when we get better about these things, even more diversity.
Yeah, it's one of the things where I talk about representation in LARP not meaning all that much to me. When I'm looking at, usually I don't care about like big world backgrounds and like knowing all these like lore characters that you're never going to interact with in game. So it doesn't matter if you like made this like 3 kings ago there was a gay king. That doesn't mean anything to me. So when you're looking at it, it's like I find what's really important is having the game, is questioning heteronormativity and heterosexism in the world's design itself, not by representative characters, but by like, is homophobia, is transphobia going to be a part of this setting? If it is, how are we addressing it? If it's not, how does that fundamentally change everything about this setting? How do we have a monarchy if royal line isn't decided by male children, and if royal line can't be by blood because you can easily have a royal couple that cannot reproduce? So it's like creating that possibility and breaking down heterosexism in the world building becomes way more important because it allows players to bring their own queerness to the game, and that openness is more important than representation, in my opinion.
Yeah, and then to inclusivity in the actual play community, that's something fundamentally different. Just because you have representation in your fiction, that doesn't mean that you have representation in your player base. And there are ways that you can facilitate building better communities for lots of different people, and advertising for different people and trying to bring people in. But a lot of that happens organically. Yeah.
Anyone else? How about your? So either take this question one of two ways. Do you want to do the good, the bad, and the ugly, which would be state something that was a problem that you encountered in terms of a queer trope or an attempt at queer design that was problematic, and suggest a way to fix it, or tell us a positive way to design a queer-friendly game, queer-friendly community. So I can give an example of a LARP that I went to where I was playing a bisexual woman who had been given the mechanic that in order to get information from anyone, she had to have sex with them. And so, classic bi, right? so it was like they had.
I do it. I don't know.
So yeah, we all adhered to that mechanic before we were on this panel. And so I pointed that out to the designer. You know, the thing is like, look, that this was not a mechanic that everyone had in the game. It wasn't like this was a fundamental part of the game. This was a an ingrained assumption that the designer had to put out. And the designer was like, we have bisexual characters in my game, right? And I'm like, and they have to have sex with everyone. So well-meaning things can end up, replicating problems. So what else? Or a positive thing to do if you don't want to call out something that was.
Yeah, I think it's something in general that I'm seeing more and more of. It's like the commodification of queerness and like the monetization of it. And that's like through both, both monetary and like social capital. It's like straight, like the cisheads. They will do things like promote queerness by saying their places are really like queer friendly, and then they're like queer safe, that the games are queer, and promoting the sense of like it's because it's cool, it's hip, like it's like being fag's awesome, very 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 hip, very in, and I mean we're all pretty both,
It's
right?
all about this panel.
Okay. So. And then it like attracts people for that reason, right? And using that as a source of like advertisement, and that is like blatantly like allyship for profit, and I see it very frequently, and it's really really hurtful and disgusting.
Yeah, I definitely have had LARPs that like advertise as queer friendly, and you show up, and it's like the follow through, it's just simply is not there. I also have like. Sometimes it's like the intention is there, but I feel like more effort is still obviously being put into seeming like a queer-friendly space than actually being a queer-friendly space. And a lot of that is like the way we use the language to talk about it and around it, instead of, I don't know, doing a lot of personal research and personal growth as a designer. It's easier to hire a sensitivity reader, and you should all pay your sensitivity readers. Pro tip. Yeah, it's really easy to get a sensitivity reader to like go through like your advertisements and your like safety doc for your game and like make sure everything is trans friendly there, or queer friendly there. But then it's so easy then to not have people like on staff at the event who are actually capable of dealing with violations if they come up, or not have anyone at the event who like a trans person feels safe talking to if they're having an issue. And things like that really lead to like that feeling of like false advertisement, which can be really hard, especially as like a queer player looking to get involved with communities and having everything is advertised as being so safe and for you, but that might not be the reality there.
Yeah, on a different topic, most of the things I've encountered haven't been like this was like a terrible trope. Like I haven't had that kind of experience in games, but what has like happened for years and years and years of my life is I've like worked and read through games and helped people run other games, and like so often with like really well-meaning people, I'm just like, okay, so like, why is this a kingdom instead of a queendom or something else? Why is the nature deity always a woman? Why are these tropes just like, why didn't you consider these things? With casting, when you do certain types of casting, I've encountered things like, oh, we've cast all of these like quieter spiritual roles, and most of the people playing them happen to be women. And so like what is actually going on in the game, and these are things that people just kind of like accidentally don't happen because they're just preconceived norms. There are other reasons and they don't do a double check or have someone else do a double check. So they're just like, it just comes up a lot, and I've just gotten to the point where I'm like, why is this way? Like, why is this person gendered this way in the lore or this important character? And just being able to say, like, maybe this can be different.
I have an unpopular opinion, if I have permission to share my
I'm ready.
Yeah, you're right. What's all?
All have
The next
all have-
question is.
That's the next question.
I don't like the pronoun mechanic. I think it's bad for the following reasons. In that,
What is the pronoun?
yeah, let's go over that first. The idea is that like if one is misgendered during an event, I think it's currently in place right now. It's like a, what did Sarah refer to them as? The social contract?
Social contract.
Yeah. Essentially that if I were to be misgendered mid-conversation, rather than correcting them with my voice and my face and my feelings, I can do yeah, exactly. I can make a peace sign, and that is to notify you that that I have been misgendered, and you are to correct that. What I have seen, how I have seen it used in blockbuster games that I have counseled at, or and in other settings where it is used, is that it is used to silence trans people. So rather than me being able to say like, hey, you just violently misgendered me, and I am now disassociating, and you kind of ruined my evening, and I don't think you can possibly understand that damage. I'm expected to do something to accommodate cis feelings, and so much of my life is already about that, and so I find it to contribute to that, and that's why like at Event Horizon I suggested like while it is optional thing to use, because maybe you're a queer person who is very interested in maintaining immersion and diegesis, and it is very good for that, right? It's you minimally break the diegesis, and you can correct the situation. However, if you don't want to be silenced about your victimhood, then you should have the option to be like, hey, like, here's what just happened.
Well, I also don't like the idea that it's somehow breaking immersion to correct pronouns verbally, because it's like, oh, well, here's the in immersion thing. Your character just misgendered that other character. Like that's still totally within the realm of the game. I don't find that immersion breaking. I have a hard time, I have a hard time remembering a ton of safety mechanics, so I'm very picky about the ones that I want in my games and the ones that I want to be interacting with. And we do already have a way to correct people on pronouns. It's talking.
I really appreciated that when Brody demonstrated, they made it not just like a secretive symbol, but as part of a conversation, being like, this is actually pronouns, and then that's like a verbal social script, which is way more useful. This has never worked for me in my entire life. I just don't see it being functionally helping to curb misgendering in the works I've been at. So yeah, I think that is a good point that you make there.
I've also, sorry, this is along the lines of the original question, as things that fall through the cracks in supposedly queer friendly LARPs or LARPs that are really trying, is I've been at LARPs where I've been gendered correctly out of character consistently and then gone into NPC roles, and no matter what role I was in, I was immediately assumed to be a woman. And part of that is in large spaces, not everyone knows me, and when you're playing multiple roles, you don't have the helpful name tag with your pronouns fucking emblazoned on it. But part of that is also like the deeper assumption that if you're playing in a setting where like asking pronouns isn't a default thing that you do when you first meet every single character, or they isn't the default pronoun of the setting, like you are opening up people to misgender people based on their character, which is a different problem that you, I don't know, don't encounter outside of LARP spaces.
Yes, I've seen that happen. Where exactly what you're talking about, because they're in a space where they're being gendered properly, thankfully, right, over and out of character, and then going out in character, and other players just slip, but then it comes through. It comes through from the character to the person, of course, and you know, in both of our primary worlds, they is the default pronoun, right? But even knowing that, that's a cognitive load that needs to stay on the players' minds to remember. And as they get more tired and they get more involved with role play, and especially I think what you've identified is something really cool is that NPCs I think have it even harder because they don't have a primary in-game identity. And so when I see you once, then I see you again. And so even with those safeguards of this is the default pronoun and things, it still happens. I'm writing that down because NPC is a big deal.
So something that I think sucks is that
Listen up, kids.
I mean, it's Roberts, I'm here to say, LARP costs a lot of money in a major way. And like, queers don't have as much money as straight people. So I don't want it to cost as much money to LARP, because that shuts us out. And not just to go to LARPs, but to make. I want making games to be like writing a poem. Like I want it to just be something that you can just do. Everybody who is making game zines right now are my heroes. Everybody who is just like brewing up something with the 3 or 4 people who are like around them and close to them and that they trust is my hero right now. Like I am really excited about that because I get really excited about making games and interacting with them and hacking them. And I think that making LARPs is so much more accessible than people realize, because even though gigantic LARPs have lots and lots of people that are weekend long or whatever, you go to them every month, like those are amazing and cool, but you can also make a LARP in a couple of hours and play it in a couple of hours. You can also make up a LARP as you go along, and those that is materially a lot more accessible to people, and that's extremely important to me. And again, if we want to, like, for example, decenter white queer voices, making things more materially accessible, making the means of production, if I dare say so, more materially accessible, that's how you're going to do that. And so we as a culture need to start really valuing, and we are like LARP culture, like this con, you know, we need to start valuing stuff that doesn't look pretty and doesn't look high production value and doesn't look like it costs a lot of money to make and engage with. So yeah, and I say this having just made like a tabletop game that has a lot of pieces and costs more money than I would probably pay for a game on most occasions. I want to start making games that like don't look that good and are a couple of pieces of paper, if that, or that are small enough that you can remember them and so play them wherever. That's what I would really like to see happen.
That's a nice way. It's like I often think about equity in terms of like redistributing material for other people, which is like a great thing. We should definitely keep doing that and way more of it. However, I think paradigm shifts, like perceptual shifts, are often a or an overlooked method of like creating equity. And doing what you just said is like rethinking about what constitutes like a quality deliverable is another way of doing that. That's a very good observation, and I'm mostly just explaining it to myself right now. If that's if you're wondering.
That's okay, restating is a form of learning.
Yeah, I want to touch on something that also you haven't talked about,
Yeah.
so.
Well, so I'm gonna say something that sucks. Nice. And I feel like this is kind of like a small thing, and also perhaps undercuts my earlier statements, but I'm gonna say it anyway. So one of the things that I find frustrating in a lot of LARPs that feature romance. So the first thing is many LARPs that feature romance don't feature any other romance that's not hetero romance. And if it does, then suddenly it must be labeled as a queer romance game. And again, that to me is like this act of othering that I find so totally frustrating. And being able to go into a game and be like, romance, I'm here for some romance, and like, it doesn't have to be like a queer romance game, right? But that there are these variable kind of romantic experiences that are available to people, and relationship configurations and relationship styles and desires, and that is what I would really love to see more of. And I think, I don't know how much we've talked about it actually now, but in a lot of the communication that we did before this panel, a lot of the rest of you were talking about this idea of like, of the maps, or of sort of like envisioning these possibilities, right? And for me, like, it becomes important to envision a possibility that doesn't have to be like marked as like, oh hey, this is some new other thing that we're doing, but instead it's like, yeah.
Can I reinforce that to the max? Because when it comes to talking about like romance mechanics and relationship mechanics at all, how we build relationships in LARP, totally fundamental thing to LARP, super important. When, you know, queer representation for me in the context of that is not that you have like, okay, heterosexual molds of what relationship looks like, except the sexual and romantic ones, you can swap out this gender for that one. Look at that. Barbie and Barbie instead of Barbie and stuff. Like, when we know from our experiences here on Earth with other people that it's not just a matter of we had the exact same relationship except the gender was swapped. We know that we have relationships that are completely different from heterosexual modes of relationship that exist right now. That we have relationships that are ambiguous, that we don't have words for because we were never given words for them. And that kind of feel like this, but kind of feel like that. And I was told that my relationships would feel this way, but instead they kind of feel like these 15 different things. And like to be able to start mechanizing those and start talking about those in relationships mechanics would be kind of cool.
I want to jump in on real quick on that. One of my favorite things that I think LARP actually accidentally does really successfully is it decenters romance. A lot of LARP, romance and friendship are suddenly at the same level because not everyone is playing with romance in every game. And I'm an aromantic person, and that is one of my favorite things about LARPs. I can have intense relationships in LARP that mimic my intense friendships in real life, but also I can have that without, kind of being othered for prioritizing those relationships. I've kind of been like on a kick talking about like relationship anarchy, which is, I think it's pretty inherently queer. I also think it's the way of actually making being poly super queer, because it's deprioritizing romantic relationships. Or rather, it's like elevating other forms of relationship. It's not just like making romance lesser, it's like, are you investing this much time and energy and emotional labor into your partner because that's what's societally expected, and would you invest that amount of time into a friend? Why not? Like, why are certain types of relationships more deserving of your work and time and emotional effort than others? And one of the things LARP accidentally does is, because not everyone goes and wants to LARP romance, suddenly there is this equity where like familial relationships become more important to your character, best friendships become more important to your character, business partners become more important to your character. And it's kind of incredible, but it's also something that I want to like actually be talking about and actually deliberately putting into our LARPs, as opposed to like this accidental byproduct.
Yeah, absolutely. And when we, like, one of the first things you do in a short, like one-shotting, for example, is quickly decide relationships.
Right.
Okay, everyone should have like 3 sort of good, solid relationships to tie them, you know, to each other, to the fiction. And that deprioritizes the couple, right? And the couple is this like heterosexist colonialist construction that I think we can all agree we're kind of done with. And so that decentralizes like whether or not you are sexually attracted to other people at all, you know, or whether or not you are romantically attracted to other people at all. And so all of a sudden queer relationships can have the place that they deserve if you can have couples, if people want to be couples, but you don't make that the primary way through which we interact with society.
And I really, like, I appreciate that idea of, like, it's not just about deprioritizing the, like, romantic, sexual, heterosexual couple, but, like, really elevating and recognizing that there are these really, really important relationships that we have that don't fall into that form. And they shape us, and they change our lives, and they're, you know, they're super, super important. And because LARP is so much about interaction and relationship building, and you can really like play out those stories in ways that, you know, this map that you were talking about, that's like, no, but this is how my life really is. Yeah. Like, it's not like that movie over there that makes no sense, but like, yeah, like these are the relationships that I actually have, and I'm getting to play them out.
Can we segue a little bit with that, because we wanted to talk about asexuality, so you talked a little bit about aromantic, but I know that it was a topic that is the sexualization of relationships.
Yeah, exactly. And I was thinking about that too when you started talking about which relationships do we value, do they have to be romantic? And like, I love making games about sex, and I love making sexy games, and I keep doing it. I don't stop me. But that is not the be-all and end-all of queerness, right? Queerness, like I think we talked about at the very beginning, is just about having, well, I don't want to reiterate everything we talked about at the beginning.
So it's not just about sex?
Exactly, yeah.
Sometimes.
But sometimes it is.
There's nothing wrong with that.
Yeah, and so like when we think about what relationships are we prioritizing and what aspects of the person, how are we defining the person, like there's so much opportunity to, again, like what do we define them by, what do we not define the person by?
We write a lot of games for kids summer camp. Like, I learned how to LARP and LARP write for the Wayfinder experience. And it's really interesting because those are games where sex is kind of off topic completely. It's like, I'm sure some teen campers have talked about whether or not their characters have had sex before, but it has not gotten back to me ever. You know? So it's like one of those things where it's like, in that environment, it's already super deprioritized, which is interesting. But then it's like, we're super lucky in that we have a super queer group of kids who are also like, where is like, how does the asexual kid actually get to explore that sexuality in a game that's already completely sexualized? Or like, how does a kid explore queerness if they also might be aro and they can't explore the sexual aspects of that? And the answer is it's probably largely not going to be able to take place at camp. is the real answer, but like it's an interesting thing to think about, just coming from the environment that we do where LARP is already super desexualized. Is there are plenty of LARPs for adults where also that sexual component is like not there at all or not really talked about, and it does create these other problems for expressing queerness, even though queerness is not all about sex.
Yeah, and also like in my experience, the type of LARPs that I've been to have been less sexual places than in my analog life. It's not the #1 power tool that is used in social interactions, which is really awesome, and I love that. And I think that the answers to a lot of these propositions are to provide openness and map-making tools and questions and conversations as opposed to descriptions and this is how it is. Because all we can really do for, there are a lot of things we can do for a queer kid, but the most important thing that we can do is to give them the tools to be able to address things in their life. And in game spaces, there's a lot more room for playing in these different subjects if you don't write the script entirely, but rather give tools and opportunities.
Yeah, and how I was going to jump into this is that I think one of the things that I find really powerful about both role-playing games and LARPs is the way in which you can play out an experience that is very fantastical and maybe doesn't look like a real-world experience, but it helps you to realize something about yourself, it helps you to realize something about your world, it helps you to realize something about questions that you've been trying to answer. And I think that for me, like thinking about creating those kinds of spaces as well, so maybe we're not talking specifically about sex or romance, but maybe we're talking about the experience of feeling like a monster, or feeling like an outsider, or feeling all of these kinds of feelings that like might map onto the queer experience without necessarily being explicitly stated as queer, but give people like ways to think about their experience or to tap into something that maybe they've been feeling but they haven't been able to like really solidify. Yeah, like I think that that's also something that is really offered by games is the ability to play in a way that teaches you lessons that you might be coming at from sort of a sideways.
A poetry angle again.
Yes.
Based on poetry. Yeah, so allegory, metaphor, right, those sorts of things. And for me, I try to do that a lot with my games. But also you have to, I would just caution, and I don't think you're advocating this, but is that people try to map those things one-to-one.
Yeah.
And it's like, no, they're not one-to-one. Being a werewolf is not equal.
Yeah.
You know, that's horrible, like to try to say, you know. Because some people play, you know, they play the werewolf and it resonates with them in this feeling of my chronic illness, right? Or other people play the werewolf and it resonates in this feeling of being bullied in school, right? And then other people it might resonate in a feeling of queerness, but you can't make these equations because then now you have othered in a terrible sort of way. We have only about 12 minutes left, so I thought maybe we'd open it up to the audience.
They're so good at talking.
I know. For some questions in the back, yes?
So I'm going to ask a question about historical accuracy, but not what you're expecting. So just a little 11, which is a really interesting LARP, I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with. It talks about sort of queerness in the 70s context. And a lot of the ways it presents queerness and the exploration of queerness is very like dependent on that time period. It's all about, you know, so it's like there's a lot of cis gay men, like gay men, because there wasn't really like the idea of cis at that point. There's like, you know, transsexuals, there's lesbians, and there's sort of like, it's a very different gender and sexual environment than what we have now. How much value can be gained from creating environments that are potentially invalidating to current gender experiences? Like, my gender doesn't really map accurately onto the world that just a little up in this building. So what value can we gain in building historical or hypothetical models of queerness that don't necessarily map to what we're talking about right now in this real life?
I would love to get started on that. I think that if the game map you're creating about a historical gender situation, if you don't have room for a player like you or a player like me to come into it, it's not historically accurate, actually. I think that it can be limiting. I mean, both my father and my father's partner are gender nonconforming gay men, and had they grown up with me in this time here, they would probably identify not as cisgender. So there's a context in which people like us and different people have existed for the entire history of the human race. And thinking about context, I think, is a great tool to be able to give those play opportunities. I would say instead of like trying to stick to historical accuracy, what I would prefer out of a historical game is an analog that allows me to play with queerness and being gay in a way that I want to. It would also allow for people who didn't want to play with those things or to play in a way that feels safe for them to allow to. So I really love playing gender nonconforming and playing with otherness in my games. Or not in games that I write, but when I'm playing. But I recognize that a non-binary person may also come into the game feeling differently. They don't actually want to deal with being like, oh, what is that person wearing over there? Or they might not want to deal with like feeling that friction. And I think that games should be able to hopefully accommodate both, or both of those games should kind of exist. But yeah, so there have been different words and contexts for these things, but I think it's limiting if we can't come in and see roles that feel like we would be there.
I'm going to jump in. So I was actually one of the organizers of the US run of JAL. And I think that for me, there was a struggle between the words that people use for their identity versus how people actually experience their identities, right? And so how do we recognize that these terms that people use for their identity have changed over time, right? That the words that we use now are not the words even we were using like 5 years ago, not the words that were being used in the 70s or 80s, right? But also recognizing that that doesn't mean that identities that people hold today didn't exist until 5 years ago, right? And as we were saying, the idea that non-binary, gender non-conforming identities, that particular sexual identities, right? That things that we didn't have terms for, it doesn't mean that people did not hold those identities. It doesn't mean that people did not have those experiences, right? And so I think that is a question that I think it's important to sort of sit with and think about when you're writing a historical game. How important is it to point that out, right? Is that something that is going to make players who are playing in today's context feel like there isn't a space for them in the game, or feel like they're not welcome in this game? Then maybe that's not an aspect of historical accuracy that you really need to include in the game, right? But then there might be reasons, depending on the particular goals of the game or the context of the game, where you feel like maybe it is important to sort of recognize these differences in terminology without predetermining how players and characters actually are experiencing their characters' identity and experience.
There are LARPs that I don't go to because despite them claiming to be like, well, we got your back, we'll be supportive, this is being friendly, like JAL being one of them, to be honest. I just don't believe it. I do not believe that, it's an access need for me to be first off, I think trans is also like a form of disability, and so it is an access need that to be seen the way I need to be and treated the way I need to be treated, and an environment like that where people are prioritizing history, or even this pressure to be something that I'm not, when that's sort of a struggle that I deal with on a day-to-day basis anyways. I feel like And if I'm having trouble with that, I know this is other people's opinion too. Like they find that sort of inaccessible. What was the LARP that didn't kickstart from Shubak? The Rocky War. Like that's sort of like a nightmare. Like I can't imagine my gender feels in an environment like that, right? And so, like that's inaccessible to me. So I'm wondering who that game is for. And if it's for someone who doesn't have like dysphoria or like isn't queer or isn't gay, etc., then like then it's tourism, and that's when I draw a line and say no. I cannot buy with that. That's disgusting to me. That makes me really mad.
Yeah, I like to talk a lot about the difference between designing a game to support and uplift queer people versus designing a game to like build cishet empathy. And to me, when I think about Just a Little Loving, it makes me as a queer person feel deeply uncomfortable to think of it as a cishet empathy game. And to think about straight people portraying this queer and like predominantly like queer black tragedy in our history to like get the feels and understand oppression, and I'm just not down with that. But so that game, I think that game in the context of being for queer people accessing their own history is a game I can get behind, but then if it's not designed to be accessible to queer people, it's not doing that. So I would always prioritize that. I also just think that like a lot of times when you are designing to build cishet empathy, it's better to use metaphor and analog, because it can be really, really fraught to have cishet people playing queer people without fully understanding it.
Yeah, and some of this can be divorced from the original intent and design. Like, I share some of those discomfort as like a player coming into playing with people I don't know or their context. Like I also know some about the context in which it was created and written and the design, like principles and things about that. So yeah, I just wanted to say that.
Yeah, thanks. Because I mean, I feel like.
Yeah, I don't want to focus on Joel,
I don't
but I'm
either.
better if you feel like
but I
you
would
did.
really, like, just quickly, I just want to say that, like, as a queer person, Joel was a life-changing experience for me. It helped me to, like, recognize and live in my queerness in a way that, like, I can say changed my life. And I think these are really important critiques and these are really important discussions to have, but I also want to recognize that, like, there are people, perhaps in this audience, who are queer, who went to Just a Little Lovin', and who maybe had a really impactful experience. And so I want to hold those things simultaneously, right? That this game might not be a game that all queer folks feel welcome to go to, but a game that some queer folks went to and felt like it was a super important, impactful experience. So I just...
Well, and I think that goes back to what we were
thank
saying. I think that what goes back to some of what we were saying at the beginning is you can't make queerness a monolithic experience, right?
And also we talked about what we wanted to do as designers
Yes.
at the beginning
Right.
of this panel, and I was like, I don't care about this, and you're like, oh, this is what it's
Actually,
be a
good.
part of what I did.
Yeah.
It's like
But
good.
that's good because we're intersecting, which is good. Yes.
We're about to, or I'm about to moderate a panel on feminism, and I'm really interested in, I know that I personally, as a non-binary person, struggle with feminism sometimes, and I'm interested to hear what you guys have to say about when feminism and queer design come into
Why did you keep it to your own head?
Just quickly, I think that any feminism that isn't aligned with gender and sexuality minorities and isn't aligned with other marginalizations and isn't intersectional and doesn't recognize the police state we live in and police violence and violence against Black people in America is not enough feminist for me. And I think that those are important questions and demands of feminism in every single context it exists in, that it has to also include all these things, or else it's weak sauce.
Also, queer theory and queer activism has to do all that shit too.
Yes.
Yes.
Like
Yes,
that's,
absolutely.
That's the thing, is that I share those frustrations a lot of the time when I hear things that are described as feminist that are just about the empowerment of white women. And I think in any context, it's so easy to like, you know, see the mote in your neighbor's eye and miss the beam in yours, right? So I totally share those concerns, and what I try to do is like hold them as a feminist, and then also like get them in even deeper, like as a queer person, because feminism being kind of like en vogue right now a little bit, has this tiny little bit of like cultural power. It doesn't really have that much, but it's got a little bit right now. So it's like, okay, great, well you have that, please have these priorities. But at some point, since they stopped making straight people after the year 2000, so queer power is rising, and so we will also be held to those demands.
Yeah, what are we
articulated.
missing too?
Yes,
That we
exactly.
see that feminism may be missing of our experience.
I have a litmus test for feminism, and it is the following. You can take this home and teach your friends, kids, and your family, specifically your family. If you refer to yourself as a feminist and you think of any given activity, let's just say LARP, and you are not willing to drop it and stop participating in it if you found material evidence that it was harmful, then you're not a very good feminist. If I question whether LARP is ethical every single day. It's something that keeps me up at night. And like when I am presented one day, and I'm sure I will be, that LARP is unethical, I'm gonna stop doing it. And I think about that as like a duty, right? As like for everybody. It's like even if you really like the thing, I think there's like an entitlement issue in game. Like I feel like I want to. There's this game I want to do, and it sure is cool, and it's about, say, prison. Like I am not allowed to write that game. So I'm not going to, right? I think just because you feel like you want to, doesn't mean you should.
Yeah, I always encounter, like, specifically being someone who's like regularly misgendered to be a woman, it's like I get hit with pretty like standard sexism directed towards women a lot, and then simultaneously like feel super excluded from mainstream feminism. And it's something that I feel like is oftentimes less present in LARP communities and LARP design, because if you actually fucking take the time and think about it, a lot of queer design and feminist design are pretty well aligned, because it's about like the cis hetero patriarchy. We have a nice term for it because like it all fits together as part of a pretty similar system, and honestly, the thing that I find the most helpful is really engaging with what language you're using around it. And like sometimes that means literally talking, if you're talking about reproductive issues, you're literally going to talk about genitals because that's what matters in that situation. Because like reproductive issues still apply to me. I'm still not a woman. They also don't apply necessarily to all women in the same way. And like being really specific and deliberate in your language, and I cannot stress, like, especially if you like want to make a LARP where like it has major themes of gender or womanhood or anything like that, I cannot stress how important it is to hire trans people. It's like the thing that makes things intersectional is getting people from all of those perspectives to work together on a project.
And paying them.
And paying them. Please
Yeah.
pay. It is fundamentally different, and it will always be fundamentally different to ask volunteer labor from a privileged group than to ask volunteer labor from an underprivileged group. It just is, especially if you are asking specifically for them to do work that centers around that marginalization. You're like, oh, this is 20 minutes of work, and it's like, yeah, but they've lived through a lifetime of oppression to give you that advice, so maybe fucking pay them, and pay them above minimum wage. Like, you know, just those things.
Can I complicate that?
Sure.
Okay.
Please,
Yeah.
God, no.
So because my sort of vision of like healthy LARP communities are not communities that necessarily like operate on a profit model, I also want to think, like, I want to recognize that pay people, a good sentiment, is shorthand for make sure that that what flows in, like, in benefit to this community is distributed not just like equally, but like you say, according to not just who is doing the work, but what's behind that work, what are they facing? You know, like $10 to this person actually literally means more than $10 to that person. And so, yes, pay people. If you're doing a thing that brings you profit, then share that profit in a way that is equitable. But also, I would like to also create LARP communities that are not operated for profit. So that means we have to think even harder about what the equivalent of pay people is.
Was it Avery? Was it Avery? Oh, probably.
Probably.
It's always Avery. Yeah, she was talking about like how she just, her utopia is just like, it's a big gay trailer park where we all play games together in.
Yes.
Like,
Yeah.
every day I want that.
That's why you have a peasant.
Back in with Alex. No, quickly. Alex Roberts. Really quickly. If you're not doing profit, I always view it as emotional labor. Is what if you're receiving emotional labor, you have to make sure that you're at least putting back out that same amount, at least.
Well, and in some other form of labor, right? Of whatever it is, whatever you have, like just recognize that you are receiving and
yeah.
I just want to piggyback what you both said, that when you pay somebody, you're investing in their thoughts. When you let somebody do emotional labor or let them do this pro bono because it's what they live through, nobody's going to pay attention. And that's the problem if you don't, and even if it's not monetary, like I'm going to pay you $50 to do an hour consult. That's great. You know, it could be, I'm going to knock some money off of your participation fee to do this thing. But the benefit of rewarding in some way that is meaningful, because maybe the money is not the thing, is that you're showing that you care, and because you've made this investment as somebody who wants to make their game better or to make their conference better, that you're also investing some emotional labor. Maybe it's through some dollars, but the joy of paying people is if you're looking at it from the perspective of the person who's giving the money, it's that you're investing in whatever they say. Maybe you don't agree with it, but you're going to listen. Because if someone's just going, hey, wait, oh, no, yeah, wait, I know I said this like 4 more times, like five days ago. That's exhausting, and they have no reason to listen to you because, I'm sorry, I keep switching like music. They have no reason to listen to you because they haven't really made any investment.
Well, and so what I would like to add, actually, Elizabeth Sempat said something interesting about being approached as an Indigenous sensitivity reader or consultant for work on digital games. That she was saying that a lot of people who are invited either for a sensitivity read or a consult on a game that's being done, she was like, you're invited, but you never go to the studio. You stay separate from the process. Something is given to you, you're given your advice on it, you have no idea how it is received, and it's fun, right? And so yes, you get paid, but she says, I would rather these people who are being paid to be consultants just get in the studio and learn how to make games so that they can eventually make their own goddamn games. And that's actually a lot scarier for existing power structures to give than $100, because that means that eventually maybe somebody's going to make a hell of a lot better games than I am.
It is 3 o'clock, so I don't know if you want to go down and say one last, very short, kind of like takeaway. Your takeaway, like.
Oh gosh, yeah, my thing is really, like, a lot of you here probably are queer designers. If you're not a queer designer, you want at least one queer person on your staff. You really do. It's important, it's gonna widen your scopes and make your game better.
I didn't get a chance to talk about it, but I think something that we want to do and are looking forward with doing is realizing what our limitations are as designers who only have so much experience, and hopefully bringing on people onto our team to make different things in a very purposefully diversifying kind of way. That's kind of where my head's been at.
So I don't design games that have a team. Usually my games are me and maybe a friend. And they don't make me any money, but they're important. So you can be a designer and you can have a team and be really thoughtful about that stuff, and it's really important. Or you can be a designer and you can just have a notebook and a pen and you can write games. And your games can say something that's really important, and you should go out and you should make those games.
Yay, you stole what I was going to say. That's okay, second that.
I make games to help me understand what's happening, because I don't get it at all. And if you feel overwhelmed and confused by life and people and what you're doing, your own motivations for things, I think making games can be one of the things that can help you feel less like a ghost or an alien.
That's beautiful. I believe that we are all complicit, and you need to accept that. And when you're designing a game, remember it and keep that at the front of your head that you're complicit in something bad, and that while you're doing the design, try to work it out.
You can do it. Your personal experience of queerness is important and valuable, and share it with others.